Hello, Ian.
Hello, Alex. Good to see you.
So I can't believe we are about to discuss chapter 23 already, flow and movement.
That's extraordinary. Yes, yes, we're going somewhere. We're in the flow. There's been movement.
That's been, and I'm gonna miss it when we reach the 28, but let's not
Oh.
get there. Okay. So, two things to say about this chapter. Well, the most important one is it has plenty of figures and drawings and images. And so, really, to the listeners and viewers, if you can go and see those.
Yes, it makes a
Um,
difference.
yes.
A
And
lot of difference. Yeah.
the other thing to say is that, again, this chapter, as many others, contains many elements, many valuable elements, and we can only touch upon a few throughout 1 hour conversation or so.
Yep. Yep.
So
But
go
we'll
and
do our
check them out.
best.
Yeah, we'll do our best and go and check them out. Okay.
Check them out. Yes. Yes.
Yes. So flow and movement throughout this chapter, there's the image of the vortex, the whirlpool. This is central.
Yes.
Tell us
Yes.
about why
Yes.
you chose that. It's so convenient and useful and fundamental.
Well, that's right. I I was struck, obviously, in preparing to write this chapter, that although I'd talked about flow in relation to time, that flow was fundamental to all things. Um, and of course, Heraclitus said that everything flows, which is not the same as the remark that everything changes.
Mm.
It includes some of that, but also includes a degree of permanence that isn't in everything changes, as well as showing more of the nature of flow, which is this indivisible
Mm.
single element.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Heraclitus who thought flow was important. Democritus said, I think he said, the cause of all things is the vortex. And I thought that was an extraordinary remark. And it intuitively resonated with my own thinking. And I'd also been reading other writers about flow. And this comes up in Schelling, who, as you know, I draw on quite a deal. And he gives this rather marvelous image of a vortex in a stream as something that is there, palpable, can have force to move objects,
Mm.
is photographable, measurable, it's completely real. And yet it is part of the flow of the water. It's not in the water, it is
Mm.
the water at the point at which one is
Yeah.
looking at a vortex.
Mm.
And what he shows is a couple of very interesting things. Is one is how a vortex has the power to move things in contrary directions. So, for example, a tornado which is a kind of vortex, has a strong upward thrust at its core of hot air and a strong downward thrust of cold air around the periphery. So it's moving in two directions, if you like, at the same time as it's being this single vortex. And just before we get into wilder, more rarefied philosophical waters, there's just a rather nice aside on the movement of fish. It has always. I live in a part of the world where there are fish that will jump up stream. They will jump up waterfalls. And I'd always wondered how on earth could he do that with the downward force of the water. But in fact, the water spirals. And although the pressure of the water on the outside is downward, the pressure in the core is upward. And so the fish can actually use the force of the vortex in order to rise up. And for this reason, even dead fish can swim upstream, which seems extraordinary. And I gather that some of the greatest swimmers in the world, like jellyfish, tend to use almost no energy when they're swimming because they rely on elements of flow. That's one thing. The other thing that's so important about it is that it demands an element of resistance. And again, I may have commented on this before, but it's a very important point that it strikes me that not only is it part of the coincidentally oppositorum, that a thing and its opposite are going to coexist, but that nothing can come into existence without a degree of resistance. I believe that matter is in fact such resistance.
Yes.
It's one way in which such resistance is expressed. But the point that he makes, that Schelling makes very clearly, is that it's not something else that gets in and creates a problem in the water. It is something that arises in the water and out of the water, so that the water brings its own resistance. Any inequality in flow in a stream will cause resistance and turbulence, and all flows in nature are turbulent. One of the things I discovered in writing this book was that turbulence is unbelievably complex. And I quote some physicist in the 1930s, Horace Lamb is his name, I forget, who had worked on the dynamics of turbulence. And he said that when I die, there are two things about which I really want to ask questions. One is about quantum mechanics, and the other one is about turbulence. On the former of these, I'm quite hopeful. So, Richard Feynman later, 30, 40 years later, said that turbulence is the most intractable problem in physics, the one that is going to take the greatest understanding. So to discover that turbulence is part of the dynamics of flow, inevitably, and that this dynamic is apparently at times resistant, but is giving force to a creative drive, is remarkable.
What an opening, Ian. I was imagining you talking to physics students before a fluid mechanics class, just as you did, especially because they're celebrities in science, persons, but also they're celebrity disciplines and sub-disciplines, right? And for instance, in physics, yes, everybody admires, and they should, quantum mechanics, relativity, high energy physics, cosmology. But then yes, there are other disciplines who are more in a minor key, like fluid mechanics, material science, right, maybe thermodynamics, which is the one I spend most time with. And you realize not only how extremely difficult they are, but also how revealing about the nature of reality. Even though, sure, in physics we know fluid mechanics, like as every, the same for relativity and so on. This applies at that scale for that energy and so on. That time temporal scale and so on. But still, like fluid mechanics, we can talk more about what this offers. But there are also some analogs of quantum processes, bouncing droplets. I don't know if you've seen them. I mean, that it offers so much to our thinking. And I'm really glad you're just lifting up the pedestal and say, well, pay more attention to fluid mechanics.
Well, good. This is wonderful to hear from you, and do enlighten me. I'm very bad at fluid mechanics, but I read a bit around it when I was writing this part of the book, and it did seem to me fascinating because it encompassed so many elements that are important, that it is not random, but it is extraordinarily unpredictable, and that it has these contrary forces in it which give it energy and so on.
Yes.
And that it can't be carved up in order to understand its parts. It simply doesn't have parts.
Yes. And let's go into it, but let me just say two more things. In terms of metaphors, my favorite one, it's a weird one, for brain, mind, consciousness stuff, is the hologram, not the computer, the hologram.
Right, yes.
But now I have a second favorite one, which is the whirlpool, thanks to you. And it's useful for life, but also to understand questions maybe like the self. And I know we're going off the tangent, but I know some people when they think about minds and bigger minds and what it means to be a person and what happens when we die and so on. Well, the whirlpool analogy is very helpful there too.
Well, yes, I think it does, particularly about the nature of the individual which we've talked about in relation to the whole, because of course the water that's in the whirlpool continues to exist when the whirlpool is no longer there. It just no longer takes the form of a whirlpool. And in that sense, it's slightly like a wave, which is another very important image, of course, that, you know, a wave in the ocean is powerful, distinct, visible, measurable, photographable, and yet it is just the water. It's not a thing in the water. It is part of the process of water. And it has individuality, but whatever it is not lost. It is another manifestation of the water at one moment, and there'll be another one later. And this is, I think, a good image of the cosmos that we belong to.
Yes. And let me just mention for our viewers to check out not just whirlpools, but solitons, what a soliton is, what a walking droplet is, and what Faraday waves are. It's a feast. It is a feast.
That's fantastic, because I don't think I mentioned any of those.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Well,
so I should be taking notes.
They are other. It's being recorded. Hopefully, they are other structures. They are other processual, structures that emerge. And again, as you said at the very beginning, they're as real as it gets. You can see them, you can touch them, they're right there. There's no spookiness, it's fluid mechanics. No. Nevertheless, they're expressing something, I believe, very deep about the nature of reality. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, the fact that they're in water is very interesting, and maybe we'll come on to talk about water later. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back into the flow of the chapter. Tell us about you.
Okay.
You open it with, of course, again, like really interesting quotes, but then you speak about Jason's Padgett's case.
Yes. Well, yes, and it's a wonderful story, though it's one that's not without its obviously traumatic aspect. Jason tells the reader in the book that he wrote about his experience that prior to an injury to his head, he had no interest in maths or geometry or anything like that. He was a furniture salesman in Tacoma, Washington. And anyway, on a night out, he was savagely attacked and sustained a significant head injury, which affected both hemispheres, but principally the right. And when he regained consciousness in hospital, he noticed that his vision had changed in a number of ways that will ring bells for people who've followed us so far on this journey. For one thing, he saw wherever there were flowing lines like water in the bath, there were straight lines at right angles running out from the curve, which is like the way in which you can approximate a circle by having a lot of tangents to that circle and just adding more and more and more, and eventually you get closer to the circle, although you never, ever achieve the full roundness of the circle. So, and we know that the left hemisphere loves straight lines and is not at ease with these. It has this linear approach to everything. It's not so at ease with the rounded shapes. So that was interesting in its first place. And then he noticed that things seemed choppy. So his vision appeared partly pixelated. Objects seemed to be more separate and isolated from one another. And movement seemed to be split up into what he called freeze frames, like I think he says like stop-go animation. If you were to show a video and very quickly switch on and off the play button, you would get a picture of this juddering movement. Now, we've discovered, or we've talked about and looked at that before in the context of injury to the right hemisphere, so that is interesting. But he then got obsessed with numbers and equations without, it has to be said, this actually displaying a real mathematical understanding, it has to be said. What he did was he started to draw pictures which he attached equations to, like E equals mc squared and other such well-known equations. But having run them past mathematicians and physicists to see if I was missing something, none of them can see any connections between the designs and the equations. But what's interesting about all these designs, and they're very beautiful, is they are entirely symmetrical. They're entirely composed of straight lines. Straight lines, so many of them, that they do produce, like tangents to a circle, the illusion of a circular shape, but always through these straight lines, and that they are often of subjects that require motion, and yet are absolutely, they're the very image of stasis. So, for example, he describes water spiraling down the plug hole, and he describes raindrops falling and so on. And then he does pictures of them. And these pictures are very fine, geometric, static, symmetrical. And this is the sort of perfect image of how the right hemisphere would see things. And one rather interesting element was an experiment done while he had his brain imaged, in which he was asked to visualize equations. And one thought that maybe to conjure an image. And his right hemisphere didn't conjure anything. It came entirely out of his left hemisphere. And the imagery fund or kitty for the left hemisphere tends to be the straight lines, these regular shapes, the symmetrical, and so on. And he particularly said that he disliked curves and disliked the idea of infinity, because it could only be approached by a series of actual things, actual numbers, which in fact it can't. But, yeah.
It reminded me of some previous chapters where you were exposing that evidence that where you ask patients that have damage, was it in the right hemisphere, and then as to justify or to account for something, they would completely make things up when pressed. And there's this expression which is to go off on a tangent. So it's like, well, there are these curves of life, but now this case you're describing, it feels like he's trying to navigate those curves by as many tangents as possible, which is a mathematical trick, but probably doesn't work for real life.
Well, what's interesting about that is that Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century, who was, of course, a great theologian, but was also a wonderful scientist who developed a way of measuring the heartbeat, and he was instrumental in optics and in all kinds of areas. He was interested in everything. But one of the things was that he proved that you cannot square the circle, which was something that was only finally proved in 1882, and we're talking about 1400 and something, but he already saw this. And what he is really illustrating is this idea of solids with ever more sides, getting closer and closer to the circle, but never actually reaching that circle. And that perception is a really important one. And it's in Bergson as well, where he talks about the path of certain analytic philosophers, which he says zigzags in order to try and approximate a curve. So it takes one straight line through the curve, then takes another straight line back, but it simply can't go into the flow of the curve in the way that intuition can.
I would ask you, and these great philosophers, well, if you cannot square a circle, does it make sense to ask whether you can circle a square?
Not really, I think, because they boil down to the same thing. I mean, you can certainly put a square into a circle, you can a circle into a square, but what you can't do is by ever more manipulations of rectangular elements or rectilinear elements, you cannot achieve a circle.
So there's no mapping. There's no mapping, which is interesting.
There's no mapping. No. So that is, as it were, something else in nature that seems to be essential. Not just the idea of extension, as I pointed out, it's not often commented on, that extension in space and time seems to bring a new element into the world. You cannot get to extension from non-extension. You can't get from a dimensionless point to a line. You can't get from a dimensionless moment to the flow of time. There's that, and there's also this thing of a curve, which you can't get to from certainly a straight line. But it's a slightly different matter, because it's not that there's something intrinsically. You have to generate a curved line from something else. It's not like that. But it has been pointed out by a number of people, including by Delacroix, that there are in nature no straight lines. When I put that into the Masters Emissary, 2 people wrote in and said, well, what about a sunbeam? And of course, light does appear to us to be straight, but one might want to be able to accept that one. But I suppose that if the space in which it travels is curved, then the light has curvature too. I don't know.
Probably we would need to imagine a space where there's really nothing else, so that the space-time is not curved. So maybe in a limit, in a abstraction. Now, let me just briefly mention again another sonata of physics in the minor key, which is chaos theory. And the idea of fractals. It's pertinent because the idea of fractals is that, well, it's like breaking lines. Yes, let's conceive of nature in this geometrical way, but it's another kind of geometry in a way where, well, metaphorically speaking, right? But where you have all these broken lines, and that's why fractals are used to maybe generate through computer simulations the structure of a tree or patterns of certain form, and it's very interesting too, because it's playful. So here we still have the straight lines, but by a very ingenious way of generating patterns within patterns, you can approximate. I'm mentioning this because of the squaring the circle. You can get a more faithful depiction of leaves and trees and natural structures through mathematics.
That's very interesting. Yes, and many things in nature have this fractal structure, don't they? I mean, probably more things than don't, actually. Yeah.
But anyways, it's a digression. So let's go back. So reality flows. You also write in this chapter, consciousness flows, everything flows. So it's not just flow because it's a useful image. You're also taking an ontological stance, right? Like everything conscious. And then you also mention here the surprising mapping in this case between the structure of the universe and the structure of our own awareness. We could even say the structure of the brain.
Yes. Well, that is an interesting element. It's tempting to ask, so do we see reality in this way because our brain has that particular structure? Or does the brain have that particular structure because it has to engage with the reality that has the structure it has? And perhaps one doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be either. I remember when I was on a panel which included Rowan Williamson, and I made the point that it's hard to decide that. He said, but does it have to be either? Which I think is good, because he's drawing attention to the fact that, once again, it doesn't have to be a linear causation. It can be an organic coming about together, much as we talked about in our last talk, I think it was, on time.
Yes. So let's speak a bit more about the value of resistance. So you speak about you write about its value and also its necessity, which is, again, can be puzzling, because you could say it's valuable, but it's also necessary. And you add more onto it, and you say not only is it necessary and valuable, but it brings beauty to the world. Tell us more about how resistance brings beauty.
Well, in a number of ways, I think. Well, first of all, because it leads to individuation, it leads to complexification, and these are elements of beauty. And that, as we may or may not have already discussed, there is this idea, I don't think we have, this idea of beauty, which I'm going to talk about in a later chapter, which derives from a marvellous so-called Platonic dialogue by Gerard Manley Hopkins, the English poet, in which effectively the point he makes is that beauty arises from the union of difference and sameness, which is really amazing because, of course, that is a theme that comes up all over the place in this book in relation to other things than beauty. But that beauty, which seems to me at the core of reality, is itself an expression of the unity of sameness with difference. And difference only comes about because of a degree of resistance. Otherwise, there would be singleness, unity, there'd be no time, there'd be no space. Everything would collapse into a single blob of whatever. And that everything that exists depends on some element of inequality or resistance. It was the inequality between the asymmetry between matter and antimatter that caused there to be a universe at all, as I understand it. And it's these asymmetries that are so life-giving and generative. And I think that once one sees that, one doesn't have to be constantly trying to do away with or explain away or disattend to elements which cause distinctions. I mean, the trouble here is that, as Wittgenstein said, we're bewitched by the language in which we try to describe the world. And I actually say one of the problems with concepts and the word we put to those concepts is that they break up things that are not necessarily in their origin separate, because the language makes reference to different points, different places, different people that are part of a single element or experience in our life. As William James says, there are elements in our experience that are not separate, even though they may be separated by years, but our mind fills in all the places between that connect them. But once they're expressed in language, all that is lost. And so one appears to be looking at, to use another image which James, in a certain form anyway, uses, we seem to be looking no longer at a landscape that is connected under the water, but after the water has risen, we see only separate pinnacles above the surface of the water. Yes. And language is like that. It shows us only some little pieces of the landscape. And that's fine, because it helps us to focus on certain elements, as long as we can move beyond that to see that that is not the fundamental nature of what we're looking at, that this is a useful tool for making distinctions, but not for accessing the fundamental nature of whatever it is we mean by the real world.
And again, using water to illustrate that point, very interesting. Like the Canary Islands, right? Like, well, like any island, right? You may consider it an island, isolated, but underneath it's connected. Yes.
It is connected to everything else, yes.
Now, your formula for beauty, or the one you were telling us, like the unity between sameness and difference, and then this explanation that whence difference? Well, from resistance. But now the point you made at the very beginning makes a lot of sense to me, and it's so important that this difference is internal to the thing itself. So not only is the whirlpool not in water, it is water, but the very resistance that it generates and it's necessary, it comes from within.
It comes from within the stream. The stream itself generates its own resistance. Now this is, I think, I sense, I intuit that this is an important element in this, because it's not as though there are, empedically it said that there were two generative forces, Philotes, love, and Nike, strife. And that is a very interesting conception, and he thought that things followed a circular path in which now the force for love triumphed, and then the force for strife triumphed, and so forth, and they reciprocated one another. And that is a very a pregnant idea, one that gives rise to many thoughts. It's rich, but I think even richer is the idea that these are not really fundamentally two different elements, but they partake of one another. And this becomes interesting in the light of the coincidence of opposites and the inescapability of the negative element, or as we think of it, the negative element in any picture, including our understanding of a human life. And when we come to talk about the sense of the sacred, my goodness, we'll have to set aside a bit of time for that one. But this idea that actually the element of resistance comes out of it is very good. And I, forgive me again if I repeat myself, but I make the point that without friction, which is the very thing that stops movement cannot get started. Movement depends on one thing moving relative to another, and the friction between them enables that movement to occur. So too little friction causes no movement, too much friction causes no movement, but a certain amount of friction leads to movement. And so that if it is true, as Bergson says, that motion is reality itself, and as Democritus put it, the being of all things is the vortex, then this resistance is in the essence of the existence of all things. There's an element of resistance provided by the driving force itself that enables it to unfold and eventuate in whatever exists.
Yes, and talking about resistance and from within, then where creativity comes from, or perhaps is an ill-posed question. Well, that question is better illuminated for me now, because it can only come from within.
Yes. Well, indeed it can, yes. Which is not to say that one doesn't derive energy, material for creativity from somewhere else, but the creativity itself comes out of one. And not, of course, by a voluntary effort.
Yes.
I mean, it may be necessary sometimes to make a voluntary effort in order that it should happen at all. But it's not during the moment when one makes the voluntary effort that the creativity happens. Wordsworth describes this very, very well in the Prelude, where he says, that the mind has to struggle with these things to express them. And however hard it struggles to do so, it cannot. But later the expression happens when one is no longer thinking about it. But it wouldn't have happened had one not had the struggle. So this is rather like the pianist's ability to play the performance well because of having applied resistance, as it were, and to the piece, dissected the flow for a time, taken it apart, but always with the point of view of somebody who is still in the right hemisphere that understands it, and therefore doesn't have to put it together again to create it or recreate it. It is already whole in that person, but it has not been waste of time doing the fragmenting or the resistant element.
Now, in continuing with water, and you're right, life without water will be impossible, which perhaps many would think is a truism, but you place that statement in a sub-part of this chapter, which is entitled Water and Philosophy, if I recall correctly. And
it's something like that.
It reminds me of Bergson's logic of solids, the critique of logic of solids. And if we think of water, and I suppose when you're saying water, we're also talking about in its fluid state. Well, how important a philosophy that also mirrors that structure, that fundamental, perhaps nature of reality, or maybe water as a symbol of reality. Well, a philosophical mode of thinking that in a way is sympathetic with that. So you say, again, life without water would be impossible. Maybe a corollary is a philosophy that doesn't have this water quality defeats its purpose, which by the way, you mentioned towards the very end with respect to analytic philosophy, again, making some friends.
Well, I know. But I have to believe there's some spirit of generosity that will take an observation of this kind in good part, because otherwise there is no point in us having discussions, really. But yes, I do think that to neglect this flow is to miss something very important. I think I discussed water, which I want to do more with you, in its relationship with both music, which we've talked about in relation to the understanding of time, and in relation to this Chinese concept of Li. And Li is a sort of foundational principle of all things. It's equivalent to the divine logos in the original sense before it meant a word. The founding principle that organizes, gives beauty and order to the cosmos, and means that it is not chaotic and ugly and pointless, but has the elements that it has everywhere, and in the inanimate world as well. I'm making slow progress at the moment through, not because it's not wonderful, but because I'm so busy. But I'm really enjoying reading the manuscript of Jude Currivan's new book called I've got it here on my desk, The Story of Gaia. And it's in it, I've only got as far as about halfway, where she's talking about what we would think of as the inanimate cosmos. And what she's talking about is its extraordinary complexity, beauty, and orderliness. It is absolutely mind-blowing, because of course I know a lot about that in biology, but I've always said that life is not discontinuous from what we call the inanimate. In fact, I argue with Robert Rosen, the philosopher of biology, that inanimacy is the limit case of animacy, that life is the norm, and that what we call the inanimate is a departure from that. And this has nothing to do with the amount of space occupied by things that we call living and those not. That's not what I'm talking about. So, coming back to that, yes, so this principle is very important in Chinese thought, and it's everywhere in nature. It's there in chemical compounds, it's there in stone, it's there in trees, it's there in the patterns made in sand by wind and water, it's there it's everywhere we look, once we learn to look for it, certainly the natural world. And in some phenomena which are man-made, they naturally result in these flowing patterns of Li. Originally, I think it was used to describe the markings in jade, which are greatly prized. The stone jade has these beautiful, and the more beautiful these patterns, the more valuable the stone. But anyway, and then I go on to talk a bit about music. And the reason I say that life without water is impossible is not just that it's true, but I'm echoing the rather playful remark by Nietzsche that life without music would be a mistake. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, not only is music something that seems central to understanding the world, it's such a mistake to think of it as something peripheral, either to life or to really understanding the cosmos, which is why many visions of the cosmos include the idea of music, that there is music in the spheres or in the heavens or in the divine or whatever there is. In fact, Nietzsche comments that the Germans even think of God as singing Lieder. But yes, and I can't help quoting the Franco-Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran, who said, I probably mispronounced his name, but never mind, who says that without the music of Bach, the whole creation could be considered a complete failure and God a totally second-rate being. I sort of half share the sentiment. Anyway, so yes, these things that flow like music, like water, are essential. And water has all kinds of properties that recommend itself philosophically. The first is that it is so central to all processes, and that's coupled with the fact that it is apparently one of the hardest chemicals to understand. It's just a simple compound of 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. You'd think this was a very simple molecule to, for example, provide a good computer model of. But according to Philip Ball's wonderful book, H2O, about the nature of water, a whole book about the meaning of the nature of water, utterly brilliant, it's one of the hardest things physicists can do is to try to model water because of its unusual way of behaving. It's a very unusual molecule. One of the unusual things about it is that it's fluid at ambient temperatures in the world. Most substances are only fluid at very high temperatures, but because of its particular nature, using hydrogen bonding, it is fluid at a natural temperature. And if it weren't for that, and the fact that ice is able to float on water, it wouldn't be possible for there to be a world at all. And of course, everything that exists in this world relies on water as an element in its structure and its formation at some point. So, yeah, it is an amazing substance.
And being intractable as a scientific topic, it's also ironic because we're talking about the creative role of friction here, right? Or resistance. So
yes.
How resistant the topic itself is to those who study it.
Yes, and turbulence. We just talked about turbulence as being one of the other things that's sort of extraordinarily intractable to our normal methods of investigation. So it's rather pleasing that certain things are absolutely central and universal, and yet by their very nature are more problematic for us to understand than most other substances, which isn't to say we can't. Of course, I'm not trying to make a sort of mystical point that we can't model them at all. We can, but the complexity of them and their nature is so extraordinary that they do command a sort of awe, in fact.
Yes, we've discussed previously the oxymoron of a theory of everything. Now, if we had to choose a theory of everything, maybe I'm being seduced by this chapter of yours, because rather than organizing it around some God-given equation, right, maybe it could be done around water. Around the idea of water.
Yes, and I know that space probes are often one of their aims is to look for the presence of water as it's a clue to there maybe being life or other things. So, no, I think that's right. I was also thinking about the beauty of you asked me about how beauty unfurls from resistance. There are some absolutely wonderful photographs which I've been able to use in this book of the effects of resistance. And what is so strange is that in an entirely regular channel with straight sides and the water running smoothly down the channel, if you put a simple linear obstacle at right angles to the flow, what do you get? You get the unpacking of a magic box. All kinds of beautiful forms come out of this thing. If you ask somebody ahead of time, so you've got a completely linear flow, you put this obstacle at right angles to it, what happens to the flow? You would not say that you get something called a Kalman vortex street, which is this line of absolutely beautifully shaped. It looks like an Art Nouveau decoration. You can imagine something out of Liberty about 1910 creating these fabulous shapes because they're orderly, they're complex, they're beautiful, and they're continuously generative. Amazing. And then there are others of just the impact of a shaft of or a blast of air on a rectangular, on a solid cube. And the shapes that come off that, again, are, certainly to me, unpredictable, but also very beautiful. Yeah. And this was something that interested Leonardo. So, again, I was able to get permission to use illustrations from Leonardo in the book, and there are 3 or 4. And they are amazing. One of them, which is quite well known, is of an old man just sitting with his stick in a stream. And Leonardo had seen these vortices coming off, and he observed them also in the patterns of a woman's hair, that there were these complex patterns in which there was a degree of stability and a degree of freedom. And it was this combination of the stability of the mass of the hair with the freedom of the smaller parts of it that created the unpredictable and unforeseen beauty of the whole. So it's a very fascinating topic, and it's good that beauty comes into it earlier in our discussion.
And this simple object plays interrupting or obstructing this flow. It literally sounds like a magic wand that, in terms of like how David Bohm would say, makes the implicate order explicate, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, that image of the implicate order being made explicit or explicate is really another one that underlies much of what we're talking about in this long series of talks. Because it is another way of thinking about the cosmos, that it is this unfolding of richness, of beauty and complexity within the cosmos. Yeah. And another thing that to do with the creative power of vortices is another thing that Leonardo, what a mind. I mean, he turned himself to just about everything he saw. He seems to have been intelligently interested in, not just drawing it, but thinking about how did this happen. And he realized that the turbulence in the aorta caused by the sinuses of Valsalva actually make it possible for the aortic valve to open sufficiently for the stream of blood to come out of the heart. Now, that is fundamental to, again, it's at the core of the human existence, is this vital blood that comes out of the heart. And there, at that very point that makes it possible for blood to go and also to not go, caused by a valve, is the turbulence caused by the valve. And that was only proved by 4D MRI in the last few years. But it was known to Leonardo that this would be the case, rather like Nicholas of Cusa having realized a number of scientific and mathematical discoveries that were not confirmed until very much later in history.
And by the way, this ontogeny of form in the physical world is also happening in the biological world. A lot of development, embryonic and so on. It's of course chemical and genes and so on, but there's matter really there, and this matter is solid, but it's also fluid, it's liquid. So those forces are at play literally in the creation and individuation of living organisms.
Yes, which was something that also Leonardo knew about and attempted to draw. Yes.
Now, let me mention one more aspect that really surprised me, and this ties together music and water, actually. And if there was such a thing as the McGilchrist Academy, well, there's the McGilchrist channel, but if there was a McGilchrist Academy, and we may need it soon because the universities are... you don't want to hear about that.
Well, no, there's a thought.
Universities are, well, finish the sentence. Well, in any case, studying physics, you will be taught about rhythm in this very way you also talk about in this chapter, right? You say rhythm, this is beautiful. Rhythm as a highly ordered obstruction to flow.
Yes. Well, yes.
You said so.
I did say so, apparently. But this is right, which brings again together so many things, that it's not a random thing. It is an obstruction to flow, and yet it enhances whatever it is. So music rarely exists without some kind of rhythm. I did at one stage in my life learn how to sing Gregorian chant, which of course is a wonderful experience, and it doesn't have rhythm exactly, but it does have a kind of flow and pauses and so on, and as well as there being rhythm in music, there is also something, as you know, called rubato, which is very slight variations in the tempo, in which a lot of the feeling is there. So that if you got a computer to play a Chopin prelude, it would lack all these very, very slight variations in rhythm, which are, again, intrinsic to life. And here I ought to mention the thing that really struck me when I was doing obstetrics in my medical training, was that when the fetal heart is entirely regular, this is an emergency. This is not good. And I thought, gosh, now there's something to know. How amazing that if it becomes mechanically regular, the fetus is distressed, and you really need to act very quickly to save it. And this is not just true, actually, of the fetus, it's also true of the adult heart, that there are important irregularities in its rhythm. I mean, obviously, if it develops peculiar dysrhythmias, then that is also not a good sign. But built into the rhythm is a certain degree of flexibility, which there also can be felt in rhythmic dancing, that there is these very, very slight pauses that really bring the movements to life. So that's interesting. And it also is, of course, a kind of reverberation. So rhythm is normally actually produced by a drum, archetypically. And the point there is that it is by striking a drum. In fact, reverberative, it means to be struck and to come back. So it is this process of something that is, a blow is given, and the thing then starts to give living waves that communicate. So this is another amazing element in our experience, and it's at the heart of physics that we now know that everything that could have been thought of in the past as particular or particulate should in fact be thought of as at least as well, if not primarily, as a wave. So these waves, these reverberations, these resonances are everywhere in nature. And it was something that Whitehead wrote about as well, very well. I think I quote him, I can't remember what he said, but he did anyway realize the importance of rhythm.
And it's not only the obstructions part of the definition or explanation of what rhythm is, like as highly ordered obstructions of flow, that really caught me. But then the notion of order, highly ordered, and to understand order beyond the naive sense of an order, a tidy room, order maybe in the sense that science, order, and creativity, the book that David Bohm and David Pitt wrote about. And order here means higher order in that sense. Like we're talking about these patterns, and they seem to form within, they seem to nest within them. They seem to be able to express higher orders in nature.
I think that's a very good point. That's right. And I suppose it's a higher order, what I'm saying about rhythm as being apparently something that disrupts the unity of the flow. It actually accentuates the unity of the flow. So that when you hear something that has a rhythm, it automatically pulls all of this together into a shape into which you yourself are also drawn. So it furthers the flow, it unites and strengthens the flow by apparently interrupting the flow. That is fascinating.
Yes, it carries everything with it, like what music does.
Yes. No, that's right. And of course, jazz and the Indian rag and the Portuguese fado are all elements of music which are partly traditionally prescribed and partly entirely originated by the performer within certain limits. So what you've got there is something that is orderly and disorderly at the same time. And it's out of that the very great creativity of fine jazz, of a good fado singer, of a great sitar player will come. Yeah.
Yes. Now, again, an hour almost passed by of conversation with you. Time flies. But there's much more in this chapter towards the end. Let's at least say something about it, because you write about motion and cognition, and you talked again about the brain, the cerebellum, and the hemispheres. So I mean, we've been captured by whirlpools and flows and rhythms. I can see it. But let's say something about the rest.
Well, yes. I mean, it depends on quite a lot of nitty-gritty science, which is why, again, anybody who's interested, I think, would be best to read what I have to say, because it's quite compressed. But what I'm really trying to explain is how motion is central to cognition, central to emotion, central to our sense of the body, and central to consciousness. That even consciousness is always consciousness of something, and is therefore a reaching out towards something. It is never just a passive thing. And but there is a lot of lovely evidence there about. I mean, some of the stuff about cognition and motion is very interesting, because it's been pointed out by many writers, and Heidegger was one, and Nietzsche was another. That thought comes to one better in motion, and that was the idea behind Aristotle's peripatetic school of philosophy. Yes. But also that that cognition and emotion and motion have a close relationship, in that even when you think of certain things, not even perhaps even a movement, but certainly if you do think of a movement, your body begins to, at some level, your brain is, the parts of your brain that will register such a motion when it occurs are already active. But so are things like when you mention lips or foot, the parts of the brain that actually are going to become active when you move your lips, when you move your foot, are already coming into play. And one of the observations that I got from my friend Thomas Back, who's a neurologist at Edinburgh, a very interesting man indeed, whose special interest has been motor neurone disorders and the relation between motion and cognition, is that things that for example, I was taught when I was studying neurology, that there are these conditions like motor neurone disease that are almost exclusively a matter of motion. There's a lot of truth in that, but we now know that there are also problems in cognition, as there are in Parkinson's disease, which is also primarily a motor disorder. And these elements in cognition particularly center on being able to find words for motions. So the word finding tends to be for verbs. The difficulty is for verbs in people with motor neurone disease. And that's not because verbs are one of the first things that go when your cognition starts failing. It's nouns that normally start to go. So it's a rather remarkable finding. And interestingly, you can have different kinds of semantic dementia for either verbs or for nouns separately. And they were both described in the 18th century, one by Vico and the other by Linnaeus, and neither of them, I think, knew of the other at the time. But there we are. So yes, cognition and motion are very important. And of course, emotion is too, because it's also, I mean, it's in the word, and also when we are moved, we're aware that our bodies are moved, and when we move in certain ways, it arouses emotions. When we feel certain emotions, it prompts certain movements in the body. And when people are not able to make movements and so on, their range of emotion becomes limited in certain ways. And there's just so much there to do with the cerebellum. You see, again, we used to think the cerebellum was just something to do with coordination. This is extraordinary because, let's just get this straight. The cerebellum has 4 times as many neurons as the cerebrum. The cerebrum being, for those of our listeners and hearers who are not familiar with these terms, the cerebrum is what you normally think of as your brain, that great big thing that you look at in the diagram. And right at the back, there's this small ancient area, that the cerebellum, which is historically ancient, and it contains 4 times as many neurons. Interestingly, although it has exponentially more connections as well as the cerebrum, it can't sustain consciousness, which is a problem for those who claim that simple numbers and complexity can give rise to consciousness, but we won't go there now. But the thing that's interesting is that the cerebellum is involved in many things, in motion, of course, in balance, coordination, all those things, but also in language, in intelligence, in and in emotion. And although it's possible to live without a cerebellum, there are, I think, I've looked at all the cases in the literature. It's not more than about 14, I think. I can't remember exactly the number, but that were found at post-mortem to be cases of cerebellar agenesis. The subjects were not phenomenologically normal. They were not neurotypical in their behaviour. But it is nonetheless something without which one can live. And then the whole business of embodied existence and the necessity for motion. It's thought that even things like perception originate in motion. So there are these very, very primitive deep sea structures that are thought not to have forms of perception, but can take in food by simply moving cilia, and this business of having found something seems to me to be likely to be the origin of perception. I mean, how one knows that they don't perceive, I really don't know, because one would have to get inside one and be one. But it is thought that is how perception even comes into being. So all of our cognition, our ability, is related to motion.
I mean,
so there's just an awful lot to say.
My favorite definition of perception is, I hate to say it, by Bergson again, perception is virtual action. Virtual action. Yes, so already there at the core is movement, flow.
Exactly right. And that's so much borne out by some modern neuroscientists who quite possibly have not studied Bergson, because a lot of people don't these days. But people in the mainstream, like Alvar Noe, a philosopher, and Kevin O'Regan, a psychologist and philosopher, that perception is an active process, that we go to meet the world, and it is so our perceptions are actions.
Yes.
And indeed our thoughts are actions. And if I'm right that the way in which we imagine the world influences what actually comes into being, then our imagination has an action, if you like, on whatever exists. I believe it does.
Yeah, the inactivist folks are in between the orthodoxy and the heresy. They are the brave heterodox thinkers, but perhaps they could continue to push. That's an invitation for you if you're listening. Continue to push the edges.
Continue to push.
Yes. Okay. So how could we wrap this up? And I'm thinking of the next chapter, the following chapter, when we're going to talk about space and matter. What bridge can you begin to point to, because we discussed recently time, now flow and movement. Now we're going to transition into space and matter.
Well, obviously motion is unthinkable, not just without time, but without space. If there is no space, there can be nowhere to move into. Or even to have one of the other kinds of motion described by Aristotle, such as growth and decay, and development, evolution, as well as locomotion. Not all of these require a change of shape in some form, which implies a change in space. So it's implied as fundamental to our ability to understand anything. And I would caution that the same strictures apply to trying to think away space as to think away time. Although, if anything, thinking away time is in my view a worse error. But fundamentally, we can't really conceive of things existing without either of these. And matter has its form in space and in time. In that, one of the things I want to be able to say about matter, but I won't go on now, is that it provides a degree of permanence to a form that is greater than things that have no material qualities. So I say everything is transient, everything flows, but things that are material just are transient a little bit more slowly.
Mm,
And funnily enough, the things that we think of as material that we don't think of as flowing are flowing, but just very slowly. So, I sometimes have mentioned the image of the mountain behind my house, which is just a wave that's flowing very, very slowly. But it's a wave.
yes,
One day
yes.
it will fall on this house.
Mm. As you were saying this, I had an experience which was akin to what you could have while watching a magic trick. Let me explain. I think what magicians do is they show you something, and then through the process, they change the affordance of that thing. And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, your perception experiences this kind of aha moment or awe, whereby a kind of a new reality is brought into being. And what I'm saying this is because now following you along this journey, and now having talked about coincidence of opposites, the one of the many. Now, what I'm trying to say is that there is a very interesting progression of ideas that, as we grow with it, what you just mentioned about matter and allowing for this permanence, it's now, again, it's like a completely different way to perceive what matter is, as opposed to that dull thing that one postulated at the beginning and let's move on. It
Yes,
comes
yes,
now after having gone
yes,
talked after having spoken about time and flow, and it's like, wow, look
yes,
at matter from
yes,
these new
yes,
eyes, this new perspective.
yes, yes. And of course, the point there is that matter is resistance. The
Mm,
difference between my idea of the table and the reaction of the reality of the table in front of me is that
mm,
in my thoughts I can travel through the
mm,
table, but in reality, the material table in front of me will not allow me to put my hand through it. That is its essential nature as being a material object. Other things are subject to my will, but matter less so. So it gives that degree of resistance, not total resistance and not no resistance. As I keep
mm,
saying, it's very important that there is this intermediary territory in which everything seems to happen.
mm. Fantastic.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
we'll try and explore space and matter next time. I just would say in signing off that um, I do feel very uncomfortable with people. Some of them obviously imaginative and intelligent who say that really there is no time and space, and that time and space are somehow facets of the way we think. Because I don't know how you could get behind our thinking to see that that was the case. Since all you know, as much as I do, is the result of the way our brains work, what is it about these things that tells you that somehow they don't exist unless the brain helps transmit or
yeah,
emit or permit
yeah,
them?
yeah.
And I just don't see
Mm,
that as logical. And I think the point I made earlier, quoting Dolev, I think his name is that if we start cutting the rug from under anything that we can perceive and know with our bodily senses, we cut the rug from science. Because even the difficult stuff in quantum physics is stuff that we know. We can not see it necessarily with our eyes, but we can see it with our eyes aided by certain machines. But we do depend on empirical knowledge to be able to think what is likely to be the case here.
yes.
And as a scientist, I feel that what is empirically knowable is that there are time and space. And I'm very happy to work with those, not as enemies, but as
Mm,
part of the way in which all the
mm,
wonders of the world can come into being.
mm,
Now, that seems to me to involve fewer feats of explaining away, fewer standing on one's head to try and deny something obvious, and a much better way of conceiving what we experience as having some degree of reality. If you
yes.
end up saying nothing we experience is real, then you're in a little bubble of your own, and it's very hard to have a conversation with you. The whole process of philosophy, of living together, of talking about these things, seems to me to depend on a degree of acceptance of these things.
Well, this opens a can of worms, which we'll try to close. But just to add to this, I know what you're talking about. I won't name names because it's not appropriate now, because we will need to expand on what they say and try to be fair to the points they're making. But I also feel there is this intellectual virus in academia and mainstream and general media, that it's kind of a pandemic of illusionism. Everything is an illusion, everything is hallucination. And what's fascinating and troubling for me about this is that both the people on the materialist, reductionist, and mechanistic side, but also other ones who are maybe at the other side, which, and this is not about friends and enemies, but like the other ones that I think are saying things that I totally embrace, seem to coincide in this fatal failure or pitfall or fallacy, which I think you and I understand, and not to say that we are right, but why are you doing this? It's like, why do you attempt to get to those ends through these weird means of saying that all of those things aren't really real?
Well said, Alex, and I'm glad to see that it exercises you as much as it does me. And just in conclusion, it lies behind the philosophical position I try to lay out in the first 8 or 12 pages of the book, which is, I am not an idealist, and I am not a naive realist. I'm not saying it just is out there, as the materialist scientists say, and I'm not saying it's something that is made up by my mind. It is in this all-important encounter, the betweenness that comes from the coming together of two elements in reality, two elements in consciousness, that the thing comes into being. And people say, well, in consciousness, have you not just declared yourself an idealist? No, I haven't. And we'll talk about consciousness more another time, because I believe consciousness has objective existence and permeates the cosmos. It's not just inside my head, your head, or anyone else's. So
we're reaching a series of grand finales here. Consciousness, the sacred. Oh my God.
I was going to say, God help us, but maybe that's an appropriate remark.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
As
Thank
always,
you very
a pleasure.
much, Alex.
Thank you, Iain.